Hey everybody, Mitchell Babarovich here with World War II Above and Below. Before we get to the podcast episode, a quick bit of housekeeping. For whatever reason, during this recording session a couple weeks ago, Riverside FM, our podcast platform, made my microphone sound like it was underwater. I haven't made any adjustments to the microphone on my computer or in Riverside FM, so I can't really explain what the hell happened. Nonetheless, the audio from my end is passable in this episode. And luckily, I don't do a whole lot of talking. I just pretty much let our guest, Dennis Blocker, take it away. Our subject is his book called Banzai Cliff, Desperation's Edge. And I would highly recommend go picking it up, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it on Spotify. A link to Amazon where you can purchase this book will be available. So be sure to go click that and pick up a copy of it. It's a great read, and this was a lot of fun to record with Dennis. And Dennis is such a nice guy, and his passion certainly comes through in his writing and this interview with him. So I think that's pretty much going to do it. And then one other thing, I have a quick shout out to my friends at 909 Apparel. I keep buying their World War II aviation shirts. There is also a link to their website in the description as well. So please go check out 909 Apparel. They're great folks. And I can't say enough about their t-shirts. I look forward to repping some of these when I go to Duxford in September for the Battle of Britain 85th anniversary air show. So if anybody's going to be at that air show in September at Duxford, please let me know. I'd love to come meet anybody that listens to the show because I'm surprised anybody other than my mother-in-law listens to this. So a huge thank you to all of our subscribers and followers out there on the various platforms that we present World War II Above and Below to you on. So with that, I'm done rambling. Let's go ahead and get to today's episode. Welcome, everybody, to World War II Above and Below. My name is Mitchell Babarovich, and I'm joined by a very special guest, someone I've been listening to for, I think, a year now. Have you been a co-host on What's a Skeleton for a year now?
Yes, sir.
Dennis? Okay, All right. So I'm joined by Dennis Blocker, who wrote Banzai Cliff, Desperation's Edge, a collection of short stories about a very specific moment during the Battle of Saipan in the summer of 1944. Really excited to talk about this book with Dennis. And Dennis, let's just go ahead and get right to it. Sure. How long did it take you to compile all this, put it together, write it, and then self-publish it? I noticed on Amazon it was a self-published book.
Yeah, and kind of regarding self-publishing, what I would encourage people is if the grand architect has put into your soul that crystal that is inserted into your being when you are formed, that you have stories to tell, why on earth are you going to wait and try and get a publishing house who all have their guys and gals that they go to for sure sales? Why are you going to keep that away from everybody? Like, people want to read, and they want new content, and they want to see new readers, new writers. Get your stuff out there. Obviously, it's important. You had it in your soul, this fire burning to tell the story. Get it out. We're fortunate nowadays we have this opportunity. And now, because of that, untold generations are going to be able to have those stories. So get it done. As far as like when it started, it really started with my grandfather, Clifford Lemke. I'm not sure how much you know about that story.
Yeah, I've listened to all your podcasts on What's a Skeleton about it.
Okay. And in, maybe the abridged version for your listeners is that my grandfather was on a gunboat in the Pacific, and the story on how that I found out about all that is, it's a long story. It involves 15 years of research and traveling all over the country and interviewing guys that were with him. The reason that I was doing this is that my mother tasked me to do it. And Grandpa was my hero, always has been. But and you're younger, and you got your friend groups, and you're going out and going to the movies and you're going to concerts and the last thing on your mind is researching World War II at this moment in my life. And Grandpa killed himself, and he shot himself. And my mom, grieving, said, "I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war." And it kind of caught me off guard, to tell you the truth. And I says, "What do we know?" And she says, "Well, from the picture, I know he was in the Navy." I was like, my goodness, 3.5 million men and women served in the Navy. It's like, oh my goodness. So it was like Atlantic, Pacific, stateside. Good.
Yeah, sure.
I had nowhere to go. However, I had this hobby and collecting World War II veteran autographs. And San Antonio is a convention town. So there was, I'm always looking through the newspapers and whatnot for conventions, like the Doolittle Raiders are coming into town and the Flying Tigers are coming into town and the CBI Veterans Association are coming into town and the World War II Fighter Aces Association is coming into town. So I got to meet Chuck Yeager and like Jack Elfrey and like all these other guys, these fighter aces. And then, well, if you have that hobby, you're definitely going to get your grandpa's autograph. And my mom reminded me of that. And I went to the book, and sure enough, he had signed it. Seaman First Class Cliff Lemke, LCI 449, 1943 to 1945. And my mom said, in the book, there's a map. And actually, let me grab that book.
Absolutely.
I didn't do this for the other podcast, but this is the book here. And it's by the Associated Press, War Against Japan. And you can see, I don't know if you can see. Actually.
Yeah, that's coming through.
Okay. It's just
a lot of signatures there.
A lot of autograph, all this page, all in here. One guy, this is the Nevada. No, I'm sorry, the Maryland. He actually circled where he was standing the moment this picture was taken.
No kidding.
And he put off to the side G.R. William and his name. But anyway, so, Grandpa's here, and he put, can you see it okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
LCI 449, 2 years, 6 months, 43 to 45. And then on the inside, there's a map. This doesn't make for great radio, but or podcasting.
That's all right. This makes people go watch it on YouTube.
But my mom says, Dennis, what Grandpa did was he circled in the map in the book. He circled where he had been, and I was, super curious because for obvious reasons. And growing up as a kid, I was an Air Force brat, and I'm born into it. So I lived in Iceland. I lived in Guam, and it was cool to find out in latter years that my grandpa had fought for Guam. He was on a gunboat there, and they were taking in the frogmen at night, doing recon missions before the invasion there. Frogmen were blowing up, the UDTs were blowing up the reefs and whatnot, creating channels for the future invasion waves. And then, to find out that my grandpa was, actually there. And I've got these great pictures. I haven't done it yet, but one thing I want to do is I got some great pictures of me on the beach playing in the sand. And one of the views is looking out to the sea. So I thought it'd be cool with me in the sand, like maybe putting like a ghost, like superimposing my grandpa's gunboat in the background.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
And then here's that map. And I'm sorry. And then here,
right. It's coming through. Yeah.
He circled Guam. He circled the Marianas. He put a little arrow to the Marianas. And then he circled Iwo Jima. And that started me on my journey there. So, when I'm interviewing these guys and I'm traveling all over the U.S., it's actually a book I'm working on right now. I'm about 90 pages in written, but it's going to be called Journey to the Heart of Hell. And it's going to be the story on how I tracked down everybody. And it'll be really great for future guys that maybe gals that want to write books, or how you find people and how you get them to, because
Yep.
even the Pulitzer Prize winning author, Mitch Weiss, who I did the book with, he asked, good God, how did you get 300 people to tell you about the worst day of their life? And I was like, well, one, I knew the material, and that's kind of interesting too, because, Mitch, back when I was a kid, I grew up in a Baptist home. And so it was very conservative. And we weren't allowed to watch movies with cuss words or sex scenes or anything like that. And so what that meant was that we could only watch movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Hays Code
So,
movies.
absolutely, right? So I'm watching, AMC on, the AMC channel,
Mm-hmm.
and, DVD collection of, and then that also meant I couldn't listen to rock music. So, yeah.
David Swing.
So that just came in handy in latter years, because,
Yep.
I'm busting out with names like, oh, I just love, Woody Herman and Count Basie and Tommy Dorsey and Artie Shaw and Glenn Miller, of course, and Benny Goodman and Harry James, and then talking about, all the actors, Carol Lombard and Clark Gable and, Joan de Havilland and Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine, and you know what I mean? And so it's really interesting the way that would come in so much handy later on in latter years. But one of my favorite things was when I was interviewing people, I found myself in a farm in Shelbina, Missouri, at Kenneth Huff's farm. And we're in the kitchen, and it's an old house, and the floor is that really cool lattice wood that's pieced together, and the house just smells of history, and it's old history, and the house is beautifully kept, and Kenneth's wife, and just feels nice and warm. But in the kitchen, the floor is all gouged out. There's this giant pit in the kitchen, and there's workmen down in the pit, and we're talking, and Kenneth pulls up a chair for me, and I sit and here we are, two dudes sitting beside this giant hole with workmen in the hole, and Ken's wife comes up, and she's got these really dainty little ceramic with painted little bowls, and there's a scoop of ice cream with chocolate and nuts, and she brings out this little silver tiny little spoons, right? And we're sitting there, and I'm eating this, and he's telling me about being at Iwo Jima. He was a bosun's mate on the 473 gunboat, and I just had to pinch myself. Like, this will never be recreated again. Like, this is an amazing opportunity. I cannot believe I'm here in this small little farming community in Missouri, and I just had to pinch myself. And there was so many stories like that. I remember one time and I'm sorry, I kind of got off on a rabbit trail.
No, that's all right. Keep going. This is great.
I remember my parents, because they had been, I've got the stacking of these cassette tapes in there, and I'm looking at them right now, the stack of cassette tapes, and my parents were like, "Oh, wow, you're doing a lot," and I was like, "Yeah, you want to sit down now? I'm getting ready to interview Junior Hollowell. He was on Grandpa's gunboat." And they're like, "Yeah." So they sit at the kitchen table, and I got my tape deck, which is old school, and I got my microphone, and then I've got my other recorder for backup. And I put the phone on speaker and hit the red and black, right? You hit the play record.
Yeah.
And and that's going. And you can hear it ringing, like ding, 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 ding. And the phone, he answers, "Hello!" And I'm caught off guard, and sir, my name is, and boom, he hangs up, and I'm like, holy, and my parents are just staring at me with their mouth wide, like what the heck just
How was that?
So I'm like, okay, maybe he thought I was a telemarketer, so I dial him back. "Hello!" I'm like, yes, sir. My name is Dennis Blocker. I'm calling. Boom! He hangs up on me a second time, right? Just slams the phone down. And I was like, forget this guy, man. Jeez. And I was like, I'll just send him a letter. Like, this is just crazy. And my mom was like, try one more time. Try one more time. Who knows what he knows? And so I was like, oh, man, how am I going to do this? So I was like, oh, all right, I got an idea. So I called him again. Hello. I said, LCI 449. What about it? My What about it? I says, my grandpa was on there. Well, so was I. Well, great. Let's talk about it. Well, all right then. So we talked for about 45 minutes, and he never talked to me again about it. His daughters couldn't believe that he talked to me, and I told them the story about how I did get him to talk, and they couldn't. They were laughing, but they were like, "He never. Like, that was a miracle." Turned out to be very fortuitous, because he turned out to be the loader for the only African American on the ship, Raphael Johnson, at the 20-millimeter gun position in the well deck starboard side. And Raphael Johnson died in the 70s, so I was unable to get his account.
Mm-hmm.
And here was a guy who was his loader. And I knew that he must have had an extraordinary experience being the only African American on a ship of 70. So I was super curious.
Yeah, that's insane.
That was remarkable to get him to talk, and he never talked to me again. And I didn't get pictures of him until he passed a couple of years later. Then his daughters finally could get access to everything he had, and they loaded me up with the pictures and stuff he had in his collection. And Raphael Johnson, though, his loader, that's somebody that I actually drove up to Decatur. Did you hear about that?
No. Huh?
So, I knew that was going to be one of the more intriguing facets of the story of the 449 gunboat, which eventually became the book, The Heart of Hell. But because of just how unique of an experience it would have been. Here you are, the only African-American guy. And that's, that can go so many bad ways. And, and then you consider that the captain of the ship is from North Carolina, and the executive officer is from Auburn, Alabama. And it's just like, and everybody knows that the steward's mate's just basically a butler, and a paid servant for the officers. And so I was like, well, this is going to be really something. But then I found out that he had been a gunner. So, and I'm a semi-intelligent guy, so I'm doing the the breakdown on that. And I know that if the officers have a problem with Raphael Johnson, they're not going to make him a gunner. They're putting the life of the ship in his hands.
Yeah.
And that's that quarter of the ship. That sector of the ship he has the life of the ship in his hands. So it was my first inkling, that realization, once I heard from Junior that Raphael was actually the gunner. That was my first inkling that there was a very remarkable story here, and something unique was happening on that ship. And it started with leadership, and it would eventually lead me to Auburn, Alabama, to the University of Auburn, and this big, huge event that they held. And they brought me out there, gave me an honorarium, and they had me present the book. And in the audience was Yarborough's family, Byron Yarborough, the executive officer. And also there was the help, and the family that had been the relatives had been the help. And once again, it spoke volumes, because if there were issues, they wouldn't have been there. And then I went to the old Yarborough home, which was incorporated into Auburn University. And there in the old Yarborough home on the table were just hundreds of these old photographs. And what was really interesting was the Christmas photographs from, I think it was like 1939, 1938. And all of the Yarborough family was gathered in front of the home, and as were the help. And they were all together, all intermingled together with big smiles and posing for these family pictures. And then it started to make sense then that, okay, everything rises and falls on leadership, right? So the atmosphere on the ship was created by Yarborough and Herring the officer, and they were ahead of their time, obviously, is in their dealings with Raphael Johnson, and we can only guess as to how he ended up on a gun, the 20 millimeter, and it had to have been that he asked if one day if he could take a crack at it. You know, they had to release the tow targets, or they release the balloons while they're en route to a, invasion of Kwajalein. And perhaps that's when they discovered, everybody else is missing. And Raphael's like, can I take a crack at it? I'm just guessing. We don't really know. No one said how that happened. But it had to have been something like that, where he had an obvious talent. And we can only surmise that maybe that was from maybe shooting 22 rifle at rabbits back in Decatur,
Sure.
On the run and being able to lead. And it's really interesting and intriguing to think about. But when I went up to Decatur, I went to the Historical Society up there, and I told the lady there I said, look, I know how things were back then. Let's just get through that. I know how it was. So can you tell me where the black part of town would have been? And she said, yeah, you're going to go down Main Street and you're going to cross the tracks and then you'll be in Colored Town. And this was 2015. And I had never heard that term Colored Town in real life. No. In Bose surround sound. And it was just caught me off guard. And I was like, wow, I'm really in the right place. And so I stopped off at the deeds office, and I saw where Raphael's dad, Roosevelt, he had purchased his own land and he had built a home on it. And it spoke a lot of his character and how he was raised, and that he had a dad that could do that, and at a time like that, and in a place like that, because Wise County back then was heavy Ku Klux Klan territory, and for years. And when I went over there, I found the deed and I placed it against the map, and I says, okay, well, I know where their house was. So I took the map, got a copy of the map, and I made my way over there, and it's a storage units. It's tore down and gone. But I looked at it. I said a prayer for the Johnsons, and let them know that one of their son's shipmate's grandson was there paying his respects, and had traveled a long way to do that. And as I was leaving, gives me goosebumps. As I was leaving, I looked to the right, and I saw an elderly black lady getting out of a car, and she was walking up to her house with some grocery bags. And that old researcher voice in me said, you got to turn around. She looks like the right age. And so I turned around. I let her get in the house. I didn't want to approach her while she was out. Sure. Yeah, that's right. So you got to use my brains. And that's something else too, that for your listeners, you got to take notes on people who are successful at researching, because they learn the hard way. You don't want to blow those opportunities, because you only get one. You only get one. I only had one opportunity with what turned out to be Miss Janet Miner. And I let her get in the house. And then I walked up to the door, and I knocked. And she cracks it and really skeptical, like, can I help you? And I held up a photograph of Raphael Johnson. I says, ma'am, do you know who this is? And she looked at it, and this giant smile crossed her face. And she said, oh my God, that's RL. And I had no idea he had been called RL back home. So that's another nugget for the book. And she's like, that's RL. And I go, oh, yes. Like, oh, wow. And she's like, come on inside. So we went inside. I took my tripod and my recorder, and we sat for a couple hours. And then she got my car, and I drove her around Decatur, and she pointed to this one building, and she says, you see that building right there? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, if you look on the outside, you'll see these rusty divots on the outside of the building going up. I says, yeah, I see that. She says, that used to hold a ladder. And we would pay for our movie tickets in the front. And then we go around the side of the building. And we'd hand over hand climb up that ladder to go access to the balcony where we could watch the movie from the balcony. That was the only way we could get there.
Unbelievable.
And that's something. And we drove on, and then she says, you see that building over there? I said, yes, ma'am. She says, it used to be a hamburger joint. And we'd go to the back and knock on the door and give them our slip of paper and the money, and they'd bring us our food to the back. We drove around she showed me where her mom was the nanny basically raised these white babies, these white kids. And they were family to her and she to them. And then we went around to the school, and she showed me where the boys would be given the hand-me-down books that weren't being used anymore, and they'd take them to the black school, and they'd have to walk a couple miles with these giant loads of books through the heat. But, those opportunities like that all come from that simple time where my mom was like, I want you to find out what happened to Daddy during the war. Mm-hmm. And then my mom at the table saying, don't give up on Junior Hollowell. Try one more time. And then having the smarts to see a lady off to the side, kind of estimate her age and realize she's in the right age group. So I had that amazing opportunity. And for the rest of my life, that's my story. I get to have that. And what's really cool is like, if I could have God's eye view on me traveling the country during those years, I imagine Adam Makos we probably were crossing the highway at the same time, right? That'd be cool to be able to see that and compare our travel itineraries. And but what's awesome, Mitch, is like just think of how many people are doing that right now,
right?
And we're gonna do it, and that's what I like doing podcasts, because I want young people to be fired up and get after it. And you've heard us talk on the podcast before that one of the big dangers and one of the things I feel sorry for the historians of the future is that they're not going to have the letters that we've had. They were going to have emails with SMH and IDK and LOL, and it just doesn't make for some riveting writing. Even if you do have the backed up text to save, I mean, it's going to be horrific.
At least it'll be legible. Some of those letters from World War II, I don't know how you were able to read some of those, but
that's true too. That's true.
Yeah, that was quite a style they had back then. So when you're doing this research, when was the starting point for the search of your grandfather's story?
Yeah, so he killed himself. I believe it was August 11th, 1999, and then it was not until 2002. That's when my mom, I guess she was reflecting back on it. That's when she asked me. So, yeah, and I didn't get my break, because you have to remember that in 2002, how old were you in 2002?
I had been 8 years old.
8 years old. So, like 2002, the internet was in its infancy, and there wasn't a lot on it, and there was dial up, and your screen would load in 16ths at a time, and which we didn't know any better. It was interesting to us, and it was something cool, but there wasn't a lot on there. And so when you're going to try and find it gives you a great respect for these guys that wrote these sweeping epics like Samuel L. Morrison, and like they just had to use card files and just old phone books. And
I think about like what Ambrose and Cornelius Ryan did, which was send out questionnaires too, right? It's just that had to have been such a pain in the ass to archive all that.
Well, and then to find the guys to send it to.
Right. Yeah.
That's like, yes. But what a great idea, of course. Sending a questionnaire isn't something that I did myself. When I first started, to the guys of the 449, I still have those in those file over there. But 2002. But it wasn't until I think 2003 I'll have to look back, but it was very soon thereafter that I saw that the LCI Association was having a reunion in San Antonio, and that's where I got my lucky break, because the guys, because I went down, of course, spent the whole day stopping everybody with an LCI hat on, and I just happened to stop Bill Brinkley and David Cox, who were at the Riverwalk, and they were eating and wrapping up, and they were figuring tips when I walked up on them. And Bill Brinkley had been on he wasn't even an LCI sailor. He was on the battleship Nevada, and he was Admiral Grosskopf's signalman and radioman. And so here he is on the bridge at Iwo Jima, and he's got a front row seat, and he watched those LCI gunboats go in on their recon mission and just get slaughtered, but stay in there. He said it sounded like giants were slamming giant sledgehammers against iron. You could hear it reverberating across the water, and you'd see bodies flying through the air. And even the UDT commander, B. Hall Hanlon, he stated that radio traffic he heard that day should have been entered alongside the best quotes from the Navy. Full damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and that sort of thing. Not John Paul Jones, I have not yet begun to fight. And one of those sayings came from the gunboat radio traffic, and I think it was the 469. And they said, over the radio crackled, "Fires under control, request permission to return to the line." And it wasn't like fires extinguished, damage. Right. You know what I mean? It was just like fires under control. And they wanted to go back in. And just that bravery, it's just staggering. But Bill Brinkley had been so moved by what he witnessed that day. And then the 441 pulled alongside. And there's a video of this. Have you seen that video?
I have not.
So we'll figure out how to get you that video. There's the 440, and it's crisp video. I mean, HD, beautifully shot. And you see the crew of the Nevadas helping the 441 with their casualties, and they're bringing them aboard for treatment. And then they lay out the 7 they put them in, you see them, they're sewing them into canvas covers. They put the shells at their feet, they sew them in, and the whole crew turns out, the Battleship Nevada, the famous Battleship Nevada. And you see the float plane there on the catapult. You see the pastor there kneeling in front of him, lifting his head to heaven with his arms outstretched. You can't hear him, of course, but you can just imagine. And then they, one by one, the crew of the gunboat of the Nevada, the battleship, they lift the guys up and drop them into the ocean there for their long trip to the bottom. And Brinkley had seen all that, and he was moved. And he made it his mission to tell their story. And he went to the archives, and he's the one that got that footage. And he got tons of other footage and photographs. And so I had stopped the right guy.
Yeah.
And he told me, when I get home, I'll send you everything I got. So I got that. That was when I got my first list of guys on the 449 with my grandpa. So I called and I talked to Leo Bedell and Overchuck and Hightower and, these other guys, and then tracked, and they knew people, and they sent me documents they had. And then next thing you know, I've got the entire crew list. And I think to date, I found of the 70, I think 65.
No 60, kidding.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. And it's, it was a lot of work, but it was even, I just got Arthur Stein, a couple months ago. I'm still after it, and in this case, the family found me, and because they were researching online, and I'm finally having a presence online enough that they were able to. So Arthur Stein, he was rough because he was Arthur Stein, New York, and it's like I go to New York and Arthur Stein, and there's like 5,000 Arthur Steins in New York, right? Well, then it turns out he moved to Florida afterwards, so I was never going to find him, and which is sad because. He only died a couple years ago, and I could have talked to him. Yeah. But, so then, next thing you know, I'm traveling all over the place and interviewing people. And I think one of the ones that kind of hit me the most was Bruce Hallett, who I got very close to. He was on a bow 40 millimeter, in a trainer position. And when I called his house, I talked to his wife, Phyllis, and she said, yeah, let me get Bruce for you. And so he comes on, hey,
Yeah.
remember what happens? And he says, were you with my grandpa at Iwo Jima? And he says, I was. And then he starts vomiting into the sink.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife is like, can you call tomorrow? And I was like, I'm never calling again. I'm so sorry. I don't mean to. She's like, no. He's very excited. He insists you call tomorrow. He wants to talk to you. So I did. And we got very close. We got to meet up several times. And I got to walk the LCI 713 up in Portland, Oregon. That's restored, beautifully restored.
Yeah.
And we got to walk the decks together. And I'll never forget it. That was great.
Who was the gentleman? It might have been Brinkley. I'm trying to remember. So when I was listening to What's a Scuttlebutt earlier this week, you mentioned a gentleman that you were talking to, and you mentioned which ship your grandfather was on, and he asked you, I mean, did your grandfather make it? Which
that was Brinkley. That? Yeah, that was Brinkley.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he turned around, looked at me, and he said, "Was your grandpa? Which one was that, son?" I said, 449. He says, "Was he at Iwo Jima?" And I go, "Yeah." Did he survive? That was my first clue.
Yeah,
something
incredible.
Terrible had happened. Something incredible had happened because really my first clue was my mom saying that Grandpa had nightmares, and she would hear him cry out in the night in the 50s when she was a little girl. So we knew something terrible had happened. And from family lore, he mentioned it was related to me by my Aunt Ellen that he had seen people jumping off a cliff. And that was my first introduction to what would become the short story that you read, which I'm very thankful, by the way. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was my first introduction to that as a possibility of something I had never heard of. And then when I started interviewing the guys, then they started mentioning the cliffs. And then, it's not the first, it's not the second. Sometimes it's the third, but most likely it's the fourth and fifth time that you talk to them that you get them to talk about something like that. So Bill Hildebrand famously told me one day, I enjoyed talking to you, Dennis, but I just feel like we talk about the same stuff every time you call, and I don't feel like I have anything new. I was like, Bill, you do know why I keep calling? Because every time I call, you come up with another story you had never told me before. He's like, seriously? I was like, yeah. So that's why I say, and then plus, for your listeners out there that want to maybe do this one day or interview somebody that had a story, is realize that they're going to have to trust you. And some guys are just gregarious, outgoing. They'll tell you right off the bat, they're fine with it. Some guys hold that very close and they'll take it to their grave. But if you'll put in the time, and that's what I said, it wasn't the fourth. Sometimes it was the fourth interview. And after I had sent them photographs and they saw I was serious, and I wasn't just, but I was serious and dedicated and deferential and respectful, then they thought I was worthy enough to hear about the people they loved that died, or the things that they saw that crushed their soul. And they just kept it in this secret place. A secret place that, sometimes was, I would find out, sometimes was hidden inside the chest of a woman and never even went to the Pacific. And Mary Uhrig, who at the time was Mary Cooper, yeah, she comes to mind there.
Now, this is the woman who, she provided you letters, I believe, that her and her husband had exchanged, and she didn't. Did you converse with her by phone, or how did that start?
Yeah, it started out by phone, and then with her daughter mostly Rebecca, and then email, because Rebecca had email, and once Rebecca had vetted me, then I got access to her mom, Mary. Her mom is just, those ladies from that time period are just so freaking classy, just class. And, but it was very it was very obvious to me that she was holding stuff close to her that she wasn't. Yeah, and she just, she didn't want to talk about it, or that she, I didn't know what the story was, but I just figured that she was just too heartbroken to talk about it. And, then when the book was only months away from being published, she calls me and it's like, I'm ready to talk. I was like, oh man. I was like, Mary, this is really getting down to the wire. I says, but, curious though, like, why now after all these years? And she says, my husband's passed away. It kind of chokes me up because it's like that kind of love and respect for your husband who's alive that she didn't even want to. She felt it was disrespectful to him to mention her previous husband while her current husband was alive. I mean, that's a whole nother level. And he had passed away, and she felt it was okay then to talk about this, her first husband. And so I set it up with Mitch, and we called her on a conference call, and it's probably the one interview that probably hit me the hardest, the most, just because I had never seen, and plus, as a writer, you're empathetic. If you try to be a good writer, you're empathetic. It means you can put yourself in places and put yourself in people's shoes. And I knew that what we were being granted access to was something very, very personal and that no one had probably ever heard before. And she told us this amazing story of this love story of how she met him and how that they met in college, and he got a job at Orange City, Iowa, and it's not where she was from. I believe she was from Indiana. And but they fell in love and they got married. This is before the war, and they started a family. And he got that job at Orange City, Iowa as a teacher and a gym coach. And so they move out there in the middle of farm country, and the war starts. And, I have the brochure from his memorial service. He's still to this day listed as missing in action. But, the people commented about how that he was his gym routines for the teenage boys resembled a boot camp, in that, not that he was mean, but that he was getting them ready physically and as much as he could mentally, because he knew what was ahead of him. And so, 41, then 42. And by the time 43 comes around, he sent a lot of his students off, and they're in the uniform, and he couldn't stand it, and so he had to sign up. And she told about that when he got to San Francisco, he had sent her telegraph and said, come on out. I got 3 days before we ship out to the Pacific, to where I'm going to meet my other ship. He says, take Rebecca to my sister, Eulela, and come on out. So she told us about being nervous and getting her clothes together and hopping on the train and going to San Francisco, and him meeting her at the station, just like a freaking gorgeous movie in Technicolor, though. And in my mind, I could just picture the steam coming from underneath the train, and she steps off, and he's there in his uniform, and they fall into each other's arms. And then she describes this 3 days of almost a Cary Grant, Deborah Carr kind of affair to remember, sort of 3 blissful days of where she's relating how they went to the opera, and then the fish market and Chinatown, and jumping on trolleys at the last second and falling into each other's arms again and laughing. And then time has come for her to go, for them to go and separate. And the original plan was that they were going to go to the ship, and she was going to see him off the ship romantically, And the reality hits him, and he's like, I couldn't bear it. So he tells her, I want to say goodbye here. And of course, we know that he wasn't sure he could keep it together, and he didn't want to cry in front of everybody. Yeah. So they say goodbye there. And she said he kept it together, and she did as well. He closed the door and walked off, and then she lost it on the bed and cried. And she said she cried for a good long while there, and then she heard the door and looked up, and he was standing in the door, tears streaming down his cheeks. He just had to come back in and hold her again. And because he felt that he wasn't going to make it. And he had told her. Interestingly, I would talk to Leo Bedell, the only officer of 7 not killed or wounded that day. And when I was visiting with Leo Bedell, he specifically told of seeing these young ensigns, Cooper, Cromer, and Corkins. You see you see the science that was involved in assigning crew. these officers, these young ensigns, just came down to alphabetical. And he walked in, Bedell walked in, and the 3 young guys were down in the bow of the ship and talking privately. And when he walked in, they were talking about who was going to make it and who wasn't on the mission to Iwo. This was their first mission, all of them, including Bedell. And Cooper said, I'm not going to make it. And he looked at Bedell and says, but you will. And someone else, Corkins says, yeah, I don't think I'm going to make it either. And it's true. They both died. And Cromer survived. Cromer said that he thought that his balls would get shot off. And then when he got hit in the groin, and he looked down, but he didn't have the guts to look and see if they were still there. So he had somebody look, and they were like, nope, you still got them. But I got to actually talk to Cromer and Duvall and, of course, Bedell. But so 3 of the 7 I got to talk to. 3 were killed, and then Herring died in '96, I think, so I couldn't get to him. But
the Medal of Honor recipient, Rufus Herring, another important thing to point out with 449.
Yeah, that's right.
Can't imagine there were many Medal of Honor recipients on LCIs in World War II.
No, he was the only one.
Yeah, okay, all right. I figured he would be.
Yeah, so he was hot stuff at the LCI reunions.
I believe it.
Yeah, those were a lot of fun too. Getting to go to those, all those characters. It's so funny because one of the great things about men is that we don't grow up in a lot of ways. So I was talking to my buddy Zach Morris, who was on the podcast, and the What's the Scuttlebutt, and he wrote this book called When the Beaches Trembled, which I'm so jealous I didn't think of that title. And
that is good.
Yes, it's like, goodness gracious, it's so amazing. But Zach and I we'd arrive, at the this particular time it was at Nashville, and we walk into the hotel, and off to the left you can hear a kazoo, and there's a bunch of guys singing, and Royal Wetzel from the LCI 70 that was hit by a kamikaze. He's playing the kazoo, just blowing his heart out on this thing, and he's got pockets full of kazoos, and he's passing kazoos out there. I still have mine. So there's just this madness. There's just all these kazoos everywhere, just blowing. The hotel staff are just they're just like, I can't believe this is the longest shift ever.
You're effectively still in the process of collecting as many interviews as you can.
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I'll tell I just found out freaking a couple weeks ago from Zach that I knew I could get the separation papers on the crew, but I didn't know you could get the whole freaking file.
Oh, wow.
And so Zach showed me how to go on archives.org, request service records, and you just keep following the prompts. Mm-hmm. And there's a little thing there where you can request, and sometimes you got to fill out more documents and get permission. But
I've done that before.
My goodness, and he's getting these giant files. So this is actually something that's ongoing right now. Is I asked Zach if he would please do that for me for my crew. So I'm super stoked about Herring and Bedell because, according to Zach, if families wrote, the officers' copies were put in their file.
Right.
So here you've got 21 guys who died and 22 who were wounded. So just imagine what could be there from all the different families. And I'm really excited to see. And of course, I requested my grandpa's, so that'll be coming hopefully pretty soon.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can have you back, and if you get that, you could give us.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, we're encroaching on an hour here, and we've got Jeff Copsetta coming up next here in about 10 minutes. So we'll look towards wrapping it up, but we're going to bring Dennis back because this has been a great conversation. One of the things that I found interesting about Banzai Cliff in these accounts that you put in is I've got a stack over there, and I'm sure as a researcher you would agree with this. When you read about, so I'm a big market garden guy. Netherlands is kind of my thing. Everything that came out after A Bridge Too Far kind of reflects the book and the movie. Like the narrative of the battle has been effective by that book and the movie. In Banzai Cliff, because we haven't really seen Saipan depicted on film before, it was interesting to me how a lot of these accounts were very consistent with one another, right? And I think that's something that you don't really see the consistency within eyewitness accounts after movies like Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers and certainly The Longest Day. I know The Longest Day affected a lot of books, how Normandy was written. And I just thought it was interesting that the consistency within the eyewitness accounts pretty much matched up with, I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, but you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. And that Mitch, that hit me hard because, you know, you're like, oh wow, this is really sad stories. But then you see that the people ashore, the people on land, the civilians, the news correspondents, they all are talking and they're all saying they saw the same thing, and they're seeing this island of bodies floating. Multiple people mentioned it. It's like that happened. Like that really happened. And it's just because there's a part of you as a human that you're hoping that it was exaggerated because it's so horrific. You're hoping that maybe people just took some creative license to spice up a story for an article or whatnot. Yeah. But then you realize that, man, these stories are all jiving with each other. Yeah. And that hit me hard. Yeah, that was a really good observation there that you made.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think what it clicked for me when you were referencing some of the Robert Sherrod notes that he made. Robert Sherrod being a very famous World War II correspondent, for those unfamiliar. But to see that his take was very similar to guys who were on the LCIs, to the Marines, to the soldiers, to the guys on the bullhorns, trying to talk those civilians down to not throw themselves off the cliff. I just thought that, you know, as much as I want to bring more attention, we all want to bring more attention to these battles, and certainly you have in this book. It does seem like when we watch movies like Saving Private Ryan and we read accounts that came out after that, there's never, I keep using the word consistency, but you can tell that pop culture style history, the Ambrose style stuff, certainly affects how history is told after that. And I feel like this is as real as it gets as far as, like, you know, memoirs and, you know, remembering what you saw gets. I mean, you can tell that all of these guys in here, this is their yesterday. Mm-hmm. That's what it seemed like when I was reading it. And that was really striking.
Yeah, for sure. And outclassing, I think it was outclassing, where he talks about coming home. And, man, I got that recorded. I couldn't believe he had opened up like that. And he was talking about those guys shaving down the meat off the bones and coming back to Treasury Island and them asking him, where would you like to do next? And he says, well, can you send me back? And they were like, oh man, you got a problem. Like, because he used to, and what was really interesting was, I've heard veterans say this, modern veterans say that they didn't know coming back, that they didn't know what home was. They didn't know if maybe they had imagined it, they had been gone and they had seen such horrific stuff, that maybe it never happened, or would they be even welcomed at home anymore because of what they've had to do and experience. And then to hear one of the greatest generations say that, when Al said that he didn't know what home was. He didn't know if he got back, would they even want him home? Mm-hmm. Because you know as well as I do, that's a stoic generation.
Yeah.
And for him, I got goosebumps all over. For him to go that deep meant so much to me, because it gave me hope, because of my personal battles with PTSD from 23 years in emergency medicine. Mm-hmm. That gave me hope that, you know what, the greatest generation was just like us, and they made it. They did okay, and just, you know what I mean? It's like you kind of take courage from that like these weren't superhuman people. He thought the same thing that I thought. That meant a lot to me to hear him talk like that.
Yeah. It's it's a great book, and Dennis, thank you for coming on here. I should clarify, we're talking about Banzai Cliff. We're going to bring Dennis back when I get a copy of the other book he did research for, The Heart of Hell by Mitch Weiss, correct? But
yes.
Now it's by Mitch Weiss, but you were heavily involved in
that. 98% of the content, yeah.
Okay, I would say that's pretty heavily involved then. Okay, so we're going to bring Dennis back on to talk about that as we're approaching an hour here. Dennis, before you go, this episode won't come out in time for Pearl Harbor Day being tomorrow. I'm curious, as someone who's done a lot of research into this and obviously published books, how do you feel about the subject of World War II going forward with... how do you feel about the safety of the subject still going forward? Do you think it's something that's still going to get taught in schools? Do you see hope in future generations still wanting to learn about this?
I think that what earlier, several years ago, I was very, very nervous about it. I'm still concerned, but I'm not as scared, because I think what saved us as historians, and you're going to smile when I say it, is video games.
Oh yeah.
Call of Duty, Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
I think that
I'm a Python guy.
There you go. They saved World War history for the future, because even today I'll see little kids and they're talking to their buddies about MP40s and it's just like, okay. It makes me feel great. So I know that people bash video games all the time. It's a waste of time, this and that. But it's something that we hadn't probably thought of as historians, how important that was going to be to reach the younger generations. And it absolutely did. And I mean, kids are, and what's also encouraging, Mitch, and you've probably seen this too, is like when you go to air shows and stuff and you'll see reenactors, and there's a lot of little kids, and their uniforms are sharp. They got everything right. They can tell you what's what. They look great, and they're fired up, and they've got their favorite movies. And it's like the grand architect in the Matrix. It just kind of sprinkles these historians, these little young historians. So it keeps it alive. So I think we're okay.
Well, you know what? That's a good note to end this podcast episode on. Dennis, thank you so much for doing this. This is a special treat for me. No, and admittedly, I'm a little starstruck still, because, like I said, I've been listening to What's the Scuttlebutt for 2 years now, and I've enjoyed your guys' conversations, and so to have 1/3 of What's the Scuttlebutt on my little podcast for a conversation is a pretty special.
Well, you're about to have Jeff, and you're going to have a great time with Jeff too.
Good. I hope so. We'll see if he can live up to it. So, Dennis Blocker, thank you so much for joining World War II Above and Below, and we will catch you guys next time.